Great. Right, now, after that quiz, it's time to hear from Richard East. We've been talking to Levi, who's working to reach the Japanese in Japan. But Richard, having spent many years in Japan and is another good friend of mine. We went on lots of onsen trips together.
We did.
Thankfully, didn't paint. We knew our limits. But Richard and his family, they have moved to London and they're now reaching the Japanese in London. So Richard, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good to be with you all this morning. And I'm just going to share my screen. Yeah, sadly, the rest of my family couldn't join us this morning. There's a picture of my wife, Catherine, and our two daughters. Actually, shortly after we returned to London from Tokyo, just under a year ago. That was a crazy time with the UK still in lockdown. So anyway, that's our family. And we were in Japan for about 12 years doing student ministry and church planting. And we're still with OMF back in London, but we're trying to reach Japanese people who are especially in London, especially younger people and especially students. So I want to share with you some really exciting opportunities. I know some of you are already able to meet Japanese people where you live, and some of you involved in sharing the gospel with those. I just can't say enough what an exciting opportunity is to befriend, to share the gospel with, and also to pray for Japanese students who are studying in the UK. I could really share so many stories of people who have met Jesus when they're outside Japan and then come back to Japan to be just an amazing blessing for the Japanese church. And some of those from decades ago who've come back to be pastors or leading members of churches, and others recently, you know, when I was working with students in Tokyo, just often meet people who no contact with Christianity in Japan and then became Christians overseas. I will share one particular story a bit later, but just for my story, oh yeah, before we go there, not just Japanese, but obviously there are many different people studying in the UK from countries where they're really unlikely to hear the gospel in their own country. So you've just had a quiz, which, by the way, I did appallingly on. I think I came 15th out of 21, so I hope I'm not sacked from OMF. But this is, I made a list of university students studying in London who come from countries where there are less than 1 in 100 people who know the gospel, who believe the gospel. So they're highly unlikely to hear the gospel in their own country, but in London they have opportunity to. Maybe you can, if you want to have a guess what the P, the T, the T and the Q, just unmute yourself and give a go at telling us where one of those are. You see Japan down there, just over 1,000 students in London. Anyone want to have a guess at some of the others that are missing? There are no prizes for this one. You don't get to get Levi's book, but.
Pakistan?
No, not Pakistan. It's Pakistan is slightly above 1% actually, but good guess.
Q for Qatar.
Very good. Yes. Yeah. Q for Qatar. Yeah. So a few of them. Poland. Yeah. I heard someone say Poland. Yeah.
Thailand.
Thailand. Yes. And one more T.
Turkey.
Turkey. Yeah. Turkey 0.04%. Well done. Yeah. So there they all are. Just in terms of my own story, my first time to Japan was with an OMF short-term program. This is me over half my lifetime ago. There's someone on the call who's actually been praying for me and my work in Japan since that time onwards. So I went to Japan with OMF short term. I was working in a church plant where they had an English school for about a year. And I was teaching students from age 5 up to about 75. And it was during that year really where I fell in love with Japan. And I saw the needs. As many of you know, probably 1 in 200 people believe the gospel. And often the other 199 have very little chance to hear. But I saw God at work during this year. Levi was talking about building relationships, sharing life and the gospel with people. I really found that to be an absolute key, maybe even more so than evangelism in the UK. Doing things together like football, onsen trips, hiking, and enjoying meals together. So in this picture, the guy next to me, Taka-san, I remember one crucial gospel conversation over a bowl of ramen. And during the year I was in Japan, he believed. He did a Bible study with the pastor of the church plant I was working at and was baptized during that year. There's another student. This is on our way up Mount Fuji. So yeah, thankfully it didn't erupt while we were on it. And that girl, Yoko, she was in the English school. And a few months after I left, during a sermon at church, she also believed. So I saw God at work, I saw the needs, and especially saw the opportunities with university students. And really ever since that time, this Bible verse has been really key for me, Matthew 9:36-38. When Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." That was a really important verse for me. After that 1 year short term, I came back to the UK. I was a school teacher for a few years and just kept on thinking about the possibility of going back and serving God longer term in Japan. While I was back in the UK, an OMF friend of mine sent me a postcard with a crowded Tokyo street scene. You've probably seen those, with like a street crossing with hundreds of people on it. And she wrote on the postcard, "Hi Richard, hope you're having a good time. How many people do you think are on this postcard? How many of them do you think know Jesus? Lots of love." And so various things just kept me thinking about the needs of Japan. So I did go back to Japan, joined OMF long term. And as I said, a lot of my work was with university students. This is me with a student in Tokyo at Tokyo University of Science. So he didn't know any other Christians on his campus, but solid Christian, but very little experience of reaching out to his friends. What I found about students in Japan is that they're available and open for hearing the gospel. You probably know Japan's a very, very busy society. Even from elementary school, you've got to get into the right middle school, and then you've got to get into the right high school. You've got to get into the right university. Really worked very hard. And then once you start work in Japan, probably the longest working hours in the world, really long commutes, and so very little time and availability. But there's often this window where Japanese students are much more flexible with their time, have free time, and they're often thinking about big questions in life. Same can be true of students in the UK, but open in a way that often they're not in the rest of their lives. But many Japanese Christians are often in a minority. Maybe they don't know of any other Christians on their campus. It's very hard for them to share their faith. You might have heard an expression in Japan, deru kugi wa utareru. The nail that sticks up will be hammered down. It's very difficult to stand out and be different. Wonderfully, this student, Shin, started a Bible study on his campus. 2 or 3 people came along and he was able to share his faith on his campus. So that's students in Japan. But when students are outside of Japan, they're often way more open to the gospel even than that. I've heard it said that as many Japanese university students become Christians inside Japan each year as become Christians outside Japan. So nearly 3 million university students studying in Japan, and obviously not tiny numbers, but proportionally very few of those would go and study overseas, but the ones that do are really open to the gospel. They're willing to meet friends, they're willing to try out new ideas, and often much more likely to come along to a church or something like that. This is my friend Yuji. He actually started off in the UK in Birmingham. This is going back about 10 years. And someone invited him along to a church, International Student Cafe. Came from completely non-Christian family, no experience of church whatsoever. But during his time in Birmingham, he was able to meet Christians, begin to get a bit of interest. And then he came to do a master's in London for a couple of years, which is where I met him. They had, his friends from Birmingham had put him in touch with our local church in London. And he was invited along to Bible study and to International Student Cafe. And wonderfully, he really began to think seriously for himself about the idea of being a Christian. He had lots of questions. I think probably his biggest question was, how can Jesus be the only way for forgiveness and eternal life? And how can Christianity really be the truth when there are so many other religions? Not only that question, can it be the right one? But if I come from a culture where so many different ideas are floating around, how can I possibly say to other people that I think I've found the right way? And remember, no Christian contact in Japan, no experience of church. But while he was here in London, was able to meet with me, open a Bible in Japanese. I was able to give him books written by Japanese Christians. I think that was pretty huge for him because he realized that there were other Japanese people who had wrestled with the questions that he'd wrestled with. I happened to have been to some churches I knew in his hometown. This kind of whole world of Japanese Christians was something that I was able to introduce him to. So after about a year in London, and with lots of people investing time and love in his life, he decided to follow Jesus. He still had lots of questions, lots of fears about going back to Japan. And one of the big things that I'm thinking about now, and maybe some of you have experienced this and could share things about, is just the difficulty of Japanese people who do become Christians outside Japan, like Yuji, often really struggle when they come back to Japan. If they don't have support networks, they don't know what it's like living as a Christian in Japan. Not only that, but they come back to Japan and immediately they've got reverse culture shock and all kinds of things to deal with. Maybe the church that they end up in Japan is really different to their experience of church in the UK, let alone the fact that it's a different language. Wonderfully with Yuji, I was able to introduce him to a couple of Christian friends in Tokyo where he was going back to. I think a few months after he'd been back, I was able to be in Tokyo, visit a church with him. And then thankfully he got really stuck in a good church, which suited him in Tokyo. A few months after that, he was baptized in that church in Japan, became a member of the church. Later on, met a Christian girl, got married, and is still going on as a Christian today, really involved in that church. So that kind of story, like I said, there are many like it, but just an amazing opportunity to connect with Japanese people. So when they're outside of Japan. I want to, oh yeah, one other thing. This is a Bible study guide. I wrote to share with international students who were in London, just a kind of short introduction using John's Gospel to introduce ideas about who God is and Jesus. Fuji was able to translate that into Japanese for me, which was brilliant. So, someone who, coming from a completely non-Christian background, thinking how to explain these things to someone like himself. So that was a real blessing too. Yeah, so just if you're already involved in reaching Japanese people, especially Japanese students who are in the UK, there's probably going to be big numbers arriving again in September. Keep going with that work. If you're able to involve others and encourage others to get involved in that, that's brilliant. And also praying for Japanese students in the UK to meet Christians, to be brave enough to come to church, to have opportunity to study the Bible, to meet Jesus in the pages of Scripture. But not only that, to be able to do that in a way that makes sense to them. And then when they're ready to go back, to get the help that they need going back to Japan. So that's the work that we're involved in, and we hope to be involved in the UK. As I mentioned before, not just Japanese students, but many different unreached countries are sending students to the UK. Some of the countries that we talked about, they're coming from countries where, you know, it's illegal for people to share the gospel with them. It's illegal for people to encourage them to believe in Jesus. In Japan, there are freedoms for people like Levi in Japan, but often a real spiritual struggle to get people interested in coming along and willing to consider Jesus for themselves. So pray for these opportunities. We've already had one Bible verse, Jesus having compassion on the crowds. Here's another verse that is really key for the work that we're doing. You remember when Paul is speaking on the Areopagus in Acts 17, he says, "From one man, God made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, those not far from any one of us." All the people who are placed next door to you, all the international students who are placed in the different universities and halls that they're in. The Lord is sovereign over that, and he's giving us opportunities to impact the gospel around the world through that. And our vision personally is to see Japanese people in London short term, won for Christ, built up in him, and return to Japan as lifelong disciple makers. You see, we're not just wanting people to become Christians and safely go back to Japan. They can be an amazing blessing to the Japanese church, to be co-workers with people like Levi, to be excited evangelists when they get back to Japan. I met one person, one university student on a campus in Tokyo, and I was sharing with him about how often the Japanese Christian students find it very hard to share their faith. They often are very nervous about doing that. He'd become a Christian in Boston, was back in Tokyo, and he just couldn't believe that anyone who had this amazing news would hesitate to share it with other people. really people who become Christians outside Japan and come back to Japan can be a huge blessing for the church there. Yeah, just keep going, help others to be involved, and if you could pray for our work, that would be wonderful. Thanks for listening. Hope there are some questions if you got some questions, and I think I'll be quiet now. Over to you, Nash.
Thank you so much, Richard. And as he said, if you do have questions, don't forget